Welcome to the Behavior Groups podcast. My name is Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. Kurt and I have interesting conversations with insightful people about how to apply behavioral sciences to work and life. In this episode, we spoke with Dr. Michael Hallsworth, the managing director of North American Insights team. We met up with him at his offices in Brooklyn.
Michael was one of the early members of the UK's Behavioral Insights team. Along with other members of the team, Michael contributed to the creation of models like MINDSPACE in 2009 and later the EAST model. Both are mnemonic tools for remembering key elements of behavioral science. We started out talking with Michael about replication of studies, since he has tried, sometimes successfully and sometimes unsuccessfully, to replicate his own studies.
Yeah, this is one of the great things about Michael, about how open he is to his successes and failures when it comes to testing. And this came to light when we discussed his very brilliant idea to change the format of the letter used by the British Tax Authority to collect taxes from delinquents. It worked great in the UK, but failed when he tried the same approach in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
What is up with Albuquerque, Tim?
Well, you'll have to listen to the podcast to find out.
It's the old man voice for Albuquerque. What is going on there?
That's how people talk in Albuquerque.
All of our Albuquerque listeners, I apologize. So with that, Michael shared his observations on confirmation bias and motivated reasoning. Both are prominent in our world today, which in my opinion means that we should even pay more attention to them. We then went down some fun rabbit holes on framing, like how using a virus metaphor for crime impacts how we respond to that crime, and how tribal we are, even inside of governments. Different divisions can be tribal against each other.
Of course, we ended on a musical note. Ba-doom chick.
Of course.
Yeah. And about how Michael played piano as a child, and he still plays a bit today. And kudos for keeping it alive at holiday gatherings, man.
Yeah,
I think
kudos.
it's terrific. And he introduced us to a band that neither Kurt and I had ever heard of, Ockerville River, a very chill Americana band out of Austin, Texas.
I like them.
Yeah,
I like them.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
It's great when our guests introduce us to new bands.
Yes. So before you listen, we would like to ask you to help us out with a favor. Stars and written reviews really help move us up in Apple's and other pod services algorithms. On Apple, if you want to give us a star or 5 stars or write a review for us, all you have to do is click on the shows area, find Behavioral Grooves, scroll down to the bottom past all of our 40 plus episodes now to rate us and write a review. And if you did that, we would greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you in advance for your support. With that, enjoy your commute to work as you listen to our very interesting interview with Dr. Michael Hallsworth.
And if you're not in a commute, well, please listen anyway. All right? You don't have to be in a commute to listen to Behavioral Grooves.
I think it's better, though. Isn't it better if you're commuting?
No, you can sit back in a chair with a glass of your favorite beverage in front of a fire and listen so intently. It is awesome.
I think it's better commuting.
We will have to agree to disagree.
Enjoy Dr. Michael Hallsworth. Welcome, Michael Hallsworth, to the Behavioral Groups podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It's good to have you. It's good to be actually in your offices in New York.
In New York, actually doing this live instead of over the internet in some way. So
yeah.
We're excited to be here. And Tim, let's start with our mandatory speed round.
Michelangelo or Monet?
Michelangelo.
All right.
Good call.
I think Monet is a bit wishy-washy.
Ooh, we might have to go there later, all right? So, life with a mobile phone, without a mobile phone, or life without a laptop?
Life without a laptop.
Okay.
Up the mountain or down the mountain?
I don't know what that means, but I'm going to say down the mountain.
Down the mountain, okay.
Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Coffee.
Oh.
English. All right.
You've only been in America for 4 months, and you're.
Is that a misnomer that all English drink tea?
No, it's not. My parents just drink it constantly. But it's just I never end up finishing a cup of tea. My wife always has a go at me and won't make it for me anymore. I just don't finish it.
Okay. So, nudge or beyond nudge?
I think beyond nudge, because nudge is something that we've done and we are doing, but I think there's always been stuff beyond nudge, and I think Thaler and Sunstein would always say there's been stuff beyond nudge as well. So I'll go beyond nudge.
Yeah. George Lowenstein's recent work has been pushing. We got the nudge thing down. Let's get to the next level.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, and you were talking just in pre-show as we were talking about this a little bit about some of the work that you were talking about behavioral government. Can you help people understand what you were talking about there? Because I think that's a little bit beyond nudge, right? So let's talk about that. Talk about some of that background and help the listeners understand what you were talking about with us there.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the beyond nudge stuff, I think if you go back all the way to what we were saying in the MINDSPACE report, which came out in 2009, we were saying that behavioral science is a lens through which you see government action. It's not just a tool in the toolkit. So you could say, we used to encounter this actually quite a bit of, we could do nudging or we could do some normal policy. And I was really like, well that's not really a distinction that makes any sense. All policies are intended to influence behaviour in some way, and so you should take into account the best evidence about what influences behaviour. And I think the behavioural government stuff is a natural progression from that, which is it takes the ideas from behavioural science and reflects them back on government. A lot of attention has been saying, how do we nudge people? But obviously, there's a long standing awareness that officials and politicians and policymakers more generally are also vulnerable to cognitive biases. Of course they are. And institutions don't fully mitigate those biases. So what we wanted to do was draw together the new research, and there's been a lot recently over the last few years that looks at measuring these biases in policymakers, and we said, well, let's collect all that together and see what comes out, see what the main kind of issues are, and then try and come up with some solutions. And I think we're pretty well placed to do that, having come out of government ourselves and seen it firsthand and been, frankly, vulnerable to all these same traps, I suppose.
Sure, we're all part of the same.
Exactly, we're not
same DNA.
Well, Tim, you said you weren't in prior podcasts.
However, I have.
The rest of us do fall prey to these traps.
I like to believe that sometimes I'm just above biases, which is horseshit, of course. But.
It is. It really is.
But excuse me, Michael.
Well, we all like to think that you're familiar with the idea of the bias blind spot.
Yes.
So,
but mine's intentional. I mean, I'm just going to avoid it.
I mean, that could be quite a good strategy. Actually, it makes you feel good.
It does.
Yeah. And there is some evidence that optimism bias can be a quite health protective thing. As long as you're not doing too many dangerous activities, then
no, not me. No, I wouldn't do that. No.
Could be okay.
Okay, but back to the policymakers and their biases.
And I say it. I'm not saying this in like, stupid politicians or anything like that. I'm saying this is just what happens when you're having to make a lot of decisions under certain pressures and so on. So we did things like, we said, how exactly does confirmation bias play out in the way we look at evidence for policy, or framing effects? How do they influence what gets on the policy agenda and how we interpret these issues? Or we looked at how really does this optimism bias, which has been well documented, play out in government? There are many examples of this. And I should say one other thing is, in the middle we had a whole bunch of stuff around groups. So a lot of policy is made in teams. And those teams introduce certain dynamics that mean that you may not want to raise uncomfortable issues. You may not want to be the person who says, is this really going to work? And so what we tried to look at, how could you address some of these? So I don't know if any of those are particularly interesting to you. I could take any of them, really.
Actually, all of them are framing and confirmation bias and optimism bias. Would you say, are they the most prevalent? Do you find those I guess there's two questions here.
Yeah.
One is, are they more common among the policymakers than the general population, do you think? Or do you just see them, given the context and the environment in which they're working, that those are more common?
So this is a really difficult question to answer, certainly empirically. So we put these, I think, 8 biases that we drew out in particular into this framework. We have, which is around, first noticing, so how do things get noticed? Deliberating, how do people discuss and debate issues to make a decision, and then executing, how do those decisions get realized in practice. And so the ones I gave you a scattergun sort of list of a few of them there. So we think these are all relatively prevalent, and these are ones where there's pretty good evidence. Within those, it's hard to say what is most prevalent. We actually did a kind of little survey of government officials, but we only had like 60 odd responses, so we can't really say.
Can't generalize out from that.
One thing we can say is that so if you take confirmation bias, we know that strong prior political views can affect the way you interpret evidence quite strongly.
Yeah.
And if you are a politician, then you've made a series of public prior strong statements. So there's a really good paper which I really think your listener might be interested in, called, I think, Evidence and Politics. It's in the British Journal of Political Science, 2017. The lead author is called Martin Backard, and another resource is called Julian Christensen.
We'll reference it in the show in the notes.
It's really easy to read as well. Yeah. And what they do is they get they basically emailed like 900 Danish politicians, elected ones, and they gave them some simple kind of questions around, here's some evidence.
Okay.
Here's school A and school B, and here's the number of satisfied and dissatisfied parents in each school. Okay, and they asked which school's performing better. Now, because the schools are of different size, you have to do some really rough percentages working out in your heads. It's not like really obvious straight away, but you can work it out generally. And if you give that to these Danish councillors, around 3/4 of them get it right. But if you then in a different arm of the experiment say publicly funded or privately funded, like one school's public or private, something really interesting happens. The people who are maybe more on the right politically and more in favour of privately funded schools, their correct response rate goes up to 90-odd%. But if it's not in line with your prior views, it goes down to around 50%. Remember, it is a 50-50 chance because there are only 2 options. And the reverse is true on the other political spectrum. So it's a really amazing result. And it just goes to show that the power of confirmation bias and motivated reasoning is such that it can, affect even your maybe it's a question mark, is it ability or willingness to give the right answer? But what's really troubling is the paper also shows that if you give more evidence, more pieces of evidence, it appears to make the problem worse rather than better.
It doesn't help.
No, and that is a kind of a problem because our whole sort of system is based on a lot of people trying to feed evidence in, more evidence, better evidence, fund evidence-based policy. And it appears it doesn't really work like that.
In fact, it sounds like people become more resistant with additional evidence. Is that a fair statement?
It can do, yeah. I mean, we don't want to over-extrapolate because other studies have said that there is this kind of tipping point where after a while there's just so much evidence that you have to sort of admit that there's something going on here.
But when you're thinking about government and the way that government, again, is designed, it is designed to take a look at evidence and then hopefully draw the right conclusions out from that evidence to make sound policy that goes beyond whatever political spectrum that you're in. Hopefully that's what's going on. And obviously this is just another, case where the best laid plans, it doesn't always work out because there's humans involved, and so humans are fallible in that way. Not fallible being the wrong probably term, that we have these biases that we know about, that impact how we actually interpret data, how we then respond to it. I was interested, you talked about all these framing and optimism bias and everything, but you also talked about groups and how policy is made in teams. And one of the things that Tim and I have been really talking about a lot lately with very different things is just how is that context of that team, and particularly we find in the political arena that you have this almost tribal component around your team and the impact that has. So help us understand some of the research that you found there.
Yeah, sure. So we talk about this under the term intergroup opposition.
Okay.
And I've seen this myself firsthand. Let's step back. So the theories around basic idea of in-group and out-group, well known that you are more likely to discount or ignore evidence if it's coming from
out-group,
rather
versus and support the in-group stories whether or not they're good.
Yeah, and there's some really interesting nuances here as well around how you also have things like false polarization. So you have a tendency to think that the outgroup is more different from you than it actually is. And we show in the report some really interesting studies from a couple of years ago now that you ask people, where if they support, I think it was affirmative action or something, how far on the left are they, and compared to you, and everyone overestimates how far the other group is different from them. And actually the two, in terms of their opinions, the two groups are really quite close, but you kind of push them away and you discount what they're saying, and they must be saying this because they're biased, they're wrong in some ways. And what I think is interesting and perhaps not thought about enough is this kind of thing does go on even within government. So you have departments with different worldviews. And if you have a policy where they have to collaborate, which is quite often, then you see this bias creeping in. And I've seen it where there are two departments in the room. One department has this prior assumption that the other one doesn't support their worldview, doesn't have the same interests as them. And I was listening to what the other group was saying, and I thought it was really helpful to them and actually was advancing their agenda, but there was just this inability to listen to it because they're different. They're the outgroup.
We see this in corporations. We've just done some work with a company recently where sales and marketing were at odds, and sort of the sales side of the organization is like, well, those damn marketing people, they don't know what they're always trying to rule the world, and then the marketing people are saying salespeople never listen, and really they're out to do the same thing. They're really on the same team, but the way that they behave when they're up against each other.
Well, and in this case, and maybe this is the same in government, I'm not sure, but they're talking two different languages to a certain degree. I mean, they are actually, marketing is talking these marketing research studies, and sales is bringing in their first-hand accounts of dealing with their clients, and they're putting more weight on those one-off kind of components, and these are putting more on the larger you might have that one-off, but in general this is it. And they're going, but we're hearing these stories over and over and over again, and so they just come at things from a different, to your point, different world viewpoint or mindset, and so it brings that in. And I don't know if there's language differences or not that you've noticed in some of that.
There'll definitely be, language differences, framing differences. I'll just digress into framing for a second. There's some really fascinating stuff that goes to the heart of politics in framing. There's a study which we talk about where, you give people some fictional statistics about a city.
Yep.
And some people see this as... the statistics about crime, actually, and some people just get it's a really small difference. One group, its crime is presented as a virus kind of spreading, and it's created by sort of an unclean environment. That's the metaphor used. And the other group gets this metaphor of kind of crime is a wild animal. It's preying on people and it's attacking people, right? And depending on the metaphors used, there's like a very big difference in the policy that people recommend, people choose to combat crime. One which is, focused on prevention and a clean environment and so on, or one which is like locking up.
Command and control.
And we give an example actually in a footnote, which was a really nice example. You can see this in the debates around crime, totally. Like, you'll see people using totally different metaphors, which are also then, these frames are incompatible.
Yeah.
So it's not, and this is a real problem when you try and get some resolution, because they just hit up against each other. There's no common language, because you're operating on totally different metaphors.
Well, and I'm making an assumption here, but it seems like they're talking to their team or their tribe or their political base in those types of instances who align with that metaphor. And it goes back to some of Jonathan Haidt's work, right? In
The Righteous Mind.
In The Righteous Mind and moral reasoning and the way that you actually are interpreting those really fundamental moral components. And so you're talking metaphors, but those metaphors resonate or they don't resonate better with your base. And so
Crime's a really emotive topic, but you can see this even in less emotive ones. Maybe so we give an example of is a redevelopment around in a forest around a town, is it an economic thing or is it a environmental thing?
Okay.
And you can see how people have totally different views on it, and that influences what they do. And the issue is that you can actually do some stuff to bridge this. So we talk about reframing, and you can find ways of bridging across the different frames people are using, connecting the frames, finding there can sometimes be relatively small shifts from your perspective that mean a lot to the other side.
Which is going to require the removal of this very black and white thinking, that we need to start thinking, we need to be willing to think in percentages or start to divide up, okay, I'm mostly committed to this, but I'm not 100% committed to something. I'm willing to be open to a slightly different frame, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so just moving on to some solutions here, we you can't focus on these behaviors in isolation, say it's just about people. It's mainly about the institutions and the systems in which people work. And that's one of the insights from behavioral science. So there are these reframing techniques you can use, and with the in-group and out-group stuff, there are things you can do. Like we talk about collaborative red teams, and I'll just explain what that means there. So red teams are this idea which is fairly well known, is used in the military and other places, cybersecurity. It's a team that is explicitly tasked to come in and challenge the system, break into the system or break down your policy or break down your idea. So they work, there's a good rationale for them, but if you go back to the in-group, out-group thing, can you see sort of the problem with them?
Yeah.
You're coming in and I'm just going to say, I'm going to discount your views because you're an outsider who's come in to try and knock us down, and I'd be defensive against it. So we were kind of thinking, well, maybe what you want to do is, if you're developing a policy, you have a team, and then at some point, a few members of your team split off, disengage themselves, come back later in the process and act as the challenge.
So they're part of the same team. They're not being this out group, they're the in group, but they're now just having a different perspective.
Yeah.
Which was a problem that Apple faced when Steve Jobs was leading the Macintosh development team. He wanted it to be a very separate group. So he went out in the middle of campus and set up a big tent and hoisted a Jolly Roger flag over the top to indicate we're the pirates. And then there was a group of people that worked on the Macintosh, and then this large group of people that did not, and it was very exclusive. It became, they segregated themselves physically and emotionally, and then when the Macintosh team needed support from the rest of the organization, they weren't getting it because they had done such a good job of becoming a red team. They failed to integrate with all the other systems that were going to rely on getting the product produced and marketed and all those kinds of things. So
they built a lot of great cohesion on the Macintosh team, but to the detriment of that working across the divisions within Apple itself. And it sounds like that's some of the things. But I like the idea of, again, just some minor shifts in thinking about have them be part of the team, separate them from the team, and then bring them back.
Successful. Yeah. I want to go now. We're going back very early in the conversation, but MINDSPACE is a really important element that maybe not all of our readers are familiar with. The work that you did on MINDSPACE, which was the forerunner to East, and I'm going to put links to all this stuff in the notes for the episode because people should be fully aware of East and MINDSPACE. But give us, if you could, give the listeners a encapsulated view of MINDSPACE.
Okay. Are you interested more in what it is or the history of what it?
Well, the history. Let's hear the history.
Let's hear the history.
This is story time.
People can read the paper, but let's hear the history. How did it come about?
Essentially there was a minister called Liam Byrne, who was a minister in the Cabinet Office, which is one department in government in the UK, kind of central department. And now I have to remember this. I think he was just interested in, Nudge had come out,
right?
And he was interested in the ideas, and I think also he had registered that the then opposition party, the Conservatives led by David Cameron, were making a big thing of this, and were sort of
of nudging.
Yeah, because George Osborne, who went on to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer, so man in charge of the money, for 6 years. He did an op-ed with Richard Thaler in 2008-9, I think. So it was known that the opposition party were going for this because it was a new, interesting idea. It appealed to them because it was maybe an alternative to regulation, the way they were thinking about it. And
interesting.
Liam Byrne spoke to a guy called Michael Bishard, who's in the House of Lords now, and was running the Institute for Government at that point, which was actually relatively new then. It was a kind of think tank which was set up to make government more effective. And David Halpern, who runs the Behavioural Insights team now, was the person who effectively kind of set it up and was director of research there. He said, can we find out more about this behavioural economics thing, and effectively commissioned the Institute to do something on it. I was working in the Institute then. David was my boss. David approached Paul Dolan at the London School of Economics, who David knew previously, and also two of his PhD students then, I think they were, Dominic King and Ivo Vlaev, who's now a professor at Warwick. Ivo, I think, actually was a lecturer then at that point. And basically the five of us worked to produce this report. And at some point, so Paul Dolan had been thinking about a mnemonic, which was SNAP, I think.
SNAP?
Yeah, but it was more focused on salience and priming and stuff. And at some point, we wanted to add more of the social, psychological dimensions in. And so a lot of playing around with letters. I remember quite late on there was a point which we said, we can shift this around. E was emotion, it could become affect, and then it works.
I see.
But at some point, also quite a funny thing you might want to know is that, do you know what the only anagram of MINDSPACE is?
The only anagram of MindSpace. No.
All right, I'm looking at it right
Words.
now.
The letters.
Pace. No, I don't.
I'll give you clues. Disease. I should have told you beforehand.
Anyway, you're gonna have to just tell us because we'll spend the next 5 minutes trying to figure this out.
So pandemics.
Pandemic.
There it is.
Pandemics.
Oh
Yeah.
my God.
So we did just briefly think. Oh,
How weird is that?
That's weird, isn't it?
Well, what was the point of coming up with the mnemonic?
Okay, sorry, yeah. So the point of the mnemonic was, up until that point, there had been a few reports that tried to apply behavioral science to policy, or had tried to sum up kind of theories of behavior change, but they'd been quite inaccessible. They'd been difficult to work with if you're a policymaker. So the idea was that a mnemonic is not everything, but allows you to remember some essential things.
Yeah.
And it might break through in a sort of salient way so people could actually use it.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what it did, actually.
It was breakthrough as far as I was concerned, because it also, in my mind, it sort of gave some shape to all of our general biases and the heuristics that we use in our decision making, and it provided some shape.
Yeah.
And then in my own practice, EAST is what I use with clients because it's just 4 letters, because and
Well,
I think Halpern acknowledged that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So MindSpace is really good because it kind of collected things together. It was never meant to be like a really academic thing. It was meant to be a
practitioner thing, right?
Yeah. But then we found that people were saying, well, if you try and do it in a workshop, it can take quite a long time. There are 9 letters, and you don't get beyond the M sometimes. And so we said, well, people are actually asking for an even more condensed, easy to access kind of framework. So that's where EAST came from.
Well, it is. Okay.
All right, so for those people who are still sitting here going, all right, what the hell is MindSpace and what the hell is EAST? Just again.
Do you want me to do it?
Yeah, just kind of encapsulate.
Okay, all right. Because I can send them in the
I know you
notes.
can, but
All
they're just sitting here confused.
We are sitting here with one of the creators of MindSpace, so would be so kind.
This is where I hope I don't get it wrong.
Well, you don't have to say all of it. You can just kind of encapsulate.
Yeah, MindSpace is a mnemonic for things like messenger, incentives, norms, defaults. So every letter stands for a concept or an influence from behavioral science, and they spell out MindSpace as a whole. EAST is about making things easy, attractive, social, and timely. So it's the same principle, but it's much shorter.
Yeah.
And it is about the influences on behavior. It's not so much. MindSpace is not a model to build from. It's a way of sort of processing these, right? It's to identify what the influences are.
It was at the very least, we're like, have you kept these things in mind? Have you thought about these things?
Have you thought about this?
If you're about to launch a policy, have you just considered, what is the default? What are the incentives here, and what are the social norms? All these kind of things.
Yeah. Was it unbearably difficult? Was it fun in the development process? I mean,
there was a point where, because we wrote MindSpace in 3 months, so it was really quick kind of thing.
That's incredible.
And there was a point I remember where there were some late nights and like, will it actually ever work? Is it actually going to work? So yeah, there were some difficult parts. It's a long time ago now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it has had a huge impact in this arena, and I know, as Tim mentioned, EAST is one of those things that is used all the time. I think at least in our world of consulting around this component, and MindSpace probably less so, but I think for some of the reasons that you just mentioned.
Yeah.
Well, and if it wasn't for MindSpace, I don't think EAST would make so much sense, actually. But, I mean, I don't want to say it's derivative, but it feels like MindSpace had to be step one in order to get to EAST.
Yeah, I mean, it was only meant to be sort of a step forward.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, MindSpace, it wasn't meant to be, this is it forever. A step forward, see if it works, see if people like it, and we can use it.
I love that.
Yeah.
So, Michael, we saw you speak at a conference a couple weeks ago out in San Francisco, And one of the things that you talked about in that conference were some of these studies that you have done, some that, again, use some framing mechanisms that work spectacularly.
And then the same frame in another situation didn't work so well.
In another context that didn't work so well, which both Tim and I were salivating over, because that's where the learning happens in our mind. It's not in what works, but it's why didn't this work, and various different things. So again, not to put you on the spot, but can you kind of outline just briefly for the listeners what some of those studies were and kind of what you found?
Maybe the tax collection study.
So these are all studies we did as part of the big What Works Cities program, which Bloomberg Philanthropies run, and so here's the very brief narrative. We know that there are certain principles that in general influence behavior, and one of them is making the narrative or the message really clear and make it really obvious what you're asking someone to do. And we've shown this in many situations. You can, for example, increase payments of overdue fines by just revamping letters to make it very clear, even just the visual representation of taking out text.
Yep.
Making the desired behavior very clear and central and isolated, and
larger fonts around the fine, for instance.
Transferring it from a letter where your first instant reaction is eek to one. Oh, I get it. So I don't like it, but I get it. So we showed various, and there are many examples of this.
Yeah.
But then, you'd think that the same principle can be applied in, pretty much any situation. It's fairly locked in. We then went to do some work with Albuquerque, and they were interested in increasing registrations or declarations that you were a woman or minority-owned business in the area, I believe, because I think there was some interest or desire to contract more with that kind of business.
And we're talking about Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Albuquerque, New Mexico. And what we did was they were writing to these businesses and saying, go online and register to show you're in this status, that it could benefit you in some way. And we redid the letter to make it much clearer and to say, we're looking. Are you owned? Are you women owned? As kind of headlines, make it very clear. The same principles, but it backfired.
Yeah.
Fewer people registered than the standard, rather boring, formal-looking letter. And we were trying to work out why this was, and we could identify a few things, like it's an unexpected communication. It's not like the latest letter in a sequence about your parking fine. It's about one where a behavior where it's totally voluntary. There are no real consequences to it. And also it's one where it could be kind of difficult to establish, is this real? Is this authentic? Does it look a bit like marketing material? Does it jar with, is this the kind of thing I expect this city
from
government,
the government to be
It
sending
didn't
to
look like
me?
a formal government message. It looked a little too slick.
Or it just looked kind of the style and tone maybe was not what people were expecting. Something wasn't quite right in for their expectations. And so it took us back to a few things over the years where we'd seen studies or where we'd tried to make things quite salient or kind of attention grabbing, and they had not worked. And one was around in 2015 we worked in Plymouth in England to increase the uptake of insulation in homes for energy saving, and we'd seen that there was some evidence that using thermal imaging can engage people more with the potential for insulation, because insulation is not the most interesting topic. So
you were trying to make it visual.
Yeah, no, and that's exactly what we did. And we showed house with all the heat escaping from it. That was one of the upgraded letters, and another was the same house and then its next door neighbour, which had been insulated and shows no heat escaping. Trying to make it visual.
Yeah.
And the results showed that the pictures made it worse. Like fewer people took up the installation, and there was an incentive of about $5,000 to do this at some point as well.
To proceed with the installation.
Yeah, if you could be bothered to do it and do the work to clear out your things temporarily, then there was an incentive over the long term in terms of I can't remember what it was. It was part of something called the Green Deal.
Well, aside from reducing your energy bills, right? I'm assuming that it would cost less.
Yeah, over the time it would cost less, but there was an actual upfront incentive, I remember as well. And then we also thought of a final example where in 2013 we did a study around organ donation. It was 1 million people in a trial about a timely reminder that you could join the organ donor register just after you renewed your vehicle tax. Mm-hmm. We put a load of different changes to the page you saw after doing the tax renewal. And one of them had a social norm. One of them had a social norm and a picture of the National Health Service logo. And one had a social norm and a picture of people, like a crowd of people looking happy. Which we thought would be effective because it kind of reinforces the social norm through a different channel, through a picture. That was the only picture that bombed. It did it did worse than no message, than just a message saying please join the organ donor register, and every other message improved it, including the ones that were almost identical apart from that picture. And we think there was something about this picture looking like stock footage. People didn't like it. So
I remember that. That you talked about this idea that the perception might have been, they could have just grabbed this from anywhere. It was sort of haphazardly put together. This isn't real people. These aren't real people. They're models or.
Well, it's very difficult to know because in hindsight we came up with all kinds of explanations.
Yeah. But I think it's interesting because we see this, or I see this in business all of the time, is this kind of component where they say, well, what worked at that other company? And just let's apply it over here. And what the nice part about what you've done and shown here is that you've actually tested these different messages and looked at the uptake on them and various different things. And things that, to your point, should have worked based on prior experience and all of the research up to that point didn't. And they didn't because of some reasons that we may not know. We obviously didn't know going into it, and even on the outcome we can make some guesses at it, but it's different things. But too often I think people go into these things without thinking about how do we test this? How do we make sure that it can have the best science behind it in the world, but context matters. And there's this component of saying this context might be just different enough than the context that was before it that it no longer works in the way that we think it will be.
The good thing is that we can over time build up our knowledge so we can maybe expand the options that we test or expand.
And how we apply it, right? In this instance, we need to apply this type of messaging. In this instance, that won't work so well. So let's think about some other way of doing it.
And that's what happened in the end with us. So we then had this final example where we thought that there were similar conditions to some of what I was talking about in, say, in Albuquerque. This was actually in Oklahoma City, and we chucked in there as well a formality option because the city had designed a quite nice looking flyer.
Okay.
And we thought, well, what happens if we put in, given these conditions, one that just looks like a boring official letter, and it was the best performing.
The boring official letter was the best performing. And what was the messaging? What was the purpose and the audience for this?
It was around, so it's quite a complicated one. It was around something called EMSA, which was a kind of insurance fund to do with emergency transport, which people had been automatically enrolled into with their water bill, and if enough people opted out, as people were gradually opting out, then it would have some negative consequence for the cost of the whole program. It would have to be funded through general taxation in some way.
Okay.
And it was just better for the participants and for the city government if they voluntarily subscribed to it.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But again, it goes back to what you're saying in Albuquerque, right? It probably was something that the letter would be an unexpected thing,
yep.
And it didn't. So it played into some of those same environmental contexts that. Is that even a word? Contexts? Did I just make that up?
Made that one up.
I just made that up.
Yeah.
That's what I thought. I do that.
But it's the first one this episode.
Check. I'm doing better than normal. I got 2 more to go before.
You said it in a very convincing way.
Up until I doubt myself, then I do. I'm sorry, but it's said in those contexts that you then can say, all right. So in this instance, let's bring in that more formal letter because we've seen it work in this instance, and there are some of these parameters that might be the best option. And I think for any of our listeners who are in business, in government, or just in their personal life, I think that's a really important thing is, we generalize these principles, these biases, these heuristics across wide scales of our lives, our business, whatever. And oftentimes, we really need to do a much better job of saying...
Well, sometimes we're right. Sometimes it's a good call, but it's not always a good call.
Right.
Because context matters.
Mm-hmm.
Michael, we have listeners who are practitioners, as Kurt just mentioned, in a variety of different environments, government, the corporate world, and some are academics, some are doing research. What do you think are 2 or 3 tips that you would want to offer listeners when it comes to applying behavioral sciences?
So I can give a tip around running trials, which is obviously not the same thing.
Right.
But it would be really focused on the details. So the ideas are not the hard work quite often. It's the really going into the details of how does this system work? You said that you can randomize, but what do you mean by that? Thinking through kind of almost obsessively what could go wrong here and how are we going to adjust for it? Taking time to really develop a relationship with the people who are delivering a service, who really know what's going on. That is the stuff that I always think is the most important.
All right, Michael. Tip number 2, just in what our listeners might learn or do.
I think tip number 2, if you think about intervention, I think it's really interesting to ask your colleagues to predict what will be the most successful thing you try. And the reason I say that is because otherwise you forget what your prior views were.
Hindsight bias.
Yeah, absolutely. So you forget that I thought that the social norm and the picture would be the most effective one. I didn't forget that actually, because
of course you didn't.
But I was totally wrong, and some quite famous academics I'm not going to name also predict that beforehand. But if you don't do that, you don't really have a record where you can actually say, yeah, no, that challenged our preconception. Otherwise, you explain it away really easily.
Yeah, Caroline Webb talked about something like that again, and she said, write it down. Write down what your prediction is, because otherwise you'll come back and you'll look at it and go, oh yeah, I knew that was going to happen. I knew that formal letter was going to be better. Yeah. All right.
Do you have a number 3? You don't have to.
No, I think those 2 are fine.
Okay. I think those 2 are fine as well. It has come to that point in our discussion where we get to talk about music. And so you grew up playing the piano. How did that influence your musical tastes?
So I think it might be the other way around, really. So I didn't start playing the piano until I was like 12, so quite late.
Oh, wow.
And I think that's because I just really did like music, so it was more of a choice to play it, I suppose.
Nice.
So yeah, and I think it's just quite a good instrument also to compose on. And it's something nice about being able to see all the options in front of you. I like as well on the piano.
Yeah.
So you weren't forced into this by your
not,
parents
no,
and saying you
no.
have to. So my 8-year-old daughter that I'm forcing to go to piano lessons right now.
I was not forced into it. No, that's the kind of the interesting, I suppose.
So did you start playing piano with the hope that someday you would play the best Christmas carols ever?
Yes. It's true that mainly I play Christmas carols now because it's when I go back home and I have access to a piano. But it wasn't my motivating ambition.
No. Okay, so what was part of the inspiration for playing?
I just really quite liked music, and I think at some point there was I actually remember there was a keyboard at a. I don't know what you call it in the US. It's like we call it a kind of a jumble sale or a car boot sale, which is like where people bring their old things to sell.
A flea market.
Yeah, Does
that sound familiar, or a garage sale?
Yeah.
But this is a community thing. Is that right? Okay.
And I remember, I think it must have been about 9 or 10. I actually convinced my parents to spend not very much money on an old keyboard because I was just really interested at that point. And I enjoyed it a lot. Yeah.
And do you play still?
When I can.
When you can, okay. What do you listen to? What's on your playlist? What are the things that you listen to these days?
It's a good question. I'm a big fan of like a band called Okkervil River. If you've ever heard of them.
Can you spell that?
Okkervil River.
Where are they from?
I get a feeling that they might have met in Austin, but the guy's from the northeast of the US.
Okay.
So I was, when I was younger, big fan of REM, particularly the 80s incarnation of REM.
Yeah, well, it was great stuff.
Driver 8 was one of my favorite songs.
Driver 8 is a great song, absolutely. And gonna confess, I went to see Steely Dan.
You don't have to confess. That's fine music.
Yeah, I did go and see Steely Dan the other week. I'm going to say that, and I thought it was really good.
Good. Yeah, and who's playing with them right now?
Not Walter Becker. That's for sure.
Regrettably, rest in peace, Walter. But I mean, there's always sort of a rotating lineup. I mean, I got to see Steely Dan with Michael McDonald and playing additional keyboards and singing, which is pretty great since he sang on,
some big hits,
Josie and Peg and all those great hits. And Boz Scaggs was playing guitar, and that was really a treat. Boz Scaggs is a terrific guitarist.
Yeah,
who knew? Right?
I didn't know. I don't know who he is.
You don't even know who he is.
I know who he is. I'm just looking blank, stupefied because that's my normal talk or look when we talk about music.
Yeah. Okay, so you like to see live music as well?
Yes and no. So I think it can be really good, but I think overall it's quite an expensive way to spend your time, because particularly when you might see something not very good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and in New York, you have a lot of options for that, and I think probably price points that you can probably do it too. So
it can be like some of the best. So I went to Glastonbury in 2009, which was brilliant. I think you had Bruce Springsteen and Radiohead and people playing, and it was really, really amazing. And then sometimes you'd spend I don't know, $40 minimum, I suppose, and you'd be like, why did I do that? That was terrible.
Yeah. Well, and the time it takes to commute and line up all the things that you need to line up to get there and to do all that. Yeah, it's there's effort.
Well, and then you get into some of the bigger shows where you're in a stadium, and depending upon where your seat is, that still can cost $200, $300, and you're There's you too, but they look like mini little people up there, and the
or you're just watching them on the big screen.
Yeah, and you're like going, why did I spend all this money when I could have just, see the YouTube video?
I actually live in New York because is quite good. I saw Smashing Pumpkins at Madison Square Gardens. It was really good.
Well, okay, so Madison Square Garden's a great venue
And
to start with. It's a great place to actually see a show.
I think this tour, I don't know if it's still going on, is actually really good. I've heard that from other people.
Yeah, they played in Minneapolis just a little while ago. Got some pretty decent reviews there. So,
Cool. Okay. Well, do we
Michael,
have anything else? Michael, do you have anything that you would like to ask us?
Tim, this is not how this works. You know,
I was just throwing something out there, and you had a perplexed look on your face, and so that's enough. Yeah, that's great. Okay, yeah.
Michael, thank you.
Then we want to thank you. We're very grateful.
It's been a pleasure.
Welcome to our grooving session, where Tim and I groove on what we learned from our behavioral groups interview, have a free-flowing discussion on some of those topics, and whatever else comes into our chill heads. Chill. It's kind of cold today here in Minnesota, so I thought chill would be an appropriate term for our heads.
And you're kind of thinking about Ockerville River? You're thinking about those guys? The Americana band?
Cool sound, yeah.
They're cool.
Chill sound. There we go. Yeah, there we go. So, Tim, what were some of the things that you thought Michael brought up that you want to group on?
Well, gosh, there's a lot, right? It was a great discussion, and we did cover a lot of things. It might be good just for our audiences to make sure that everybody's grounded in MINDSPACE and easy. That might be a good thing to
East.
Yeah, did I say easy?
You said easy. Yeah.
I meant
it is easy to mix up East and easy,
yeah.
But it is East.
It is East, yes.
Yeah, so
I was thinking maybe we should just start with that.
Good.
How about that?
Good. And I love MINDSPACE. It's hard to remember all of them, but I really like the first one, which is Messenger.
Yeah.
So we're heavily influenced by who communicates the information. It's the messenger effect. And again, today in the political environment that we're in, as well as even just thinking about, people we like or people we don't like, the content of the message is less important sometimes than who is actually saying that message.
We've encountered this in our work. I've worked with a client where they were asking farmers to choose more sustainable farming methods. The farmers were not interested in listening to either the manufacturers of the seed or the academics who did the science behind it and the studies, but they were willing to listen to each other. Mm-hmm. And so the messenger was a really critical element aspect of what got the farmers to adopt more sustainable farming methods.
Yeah, the same content, just delivered by a different person. We've talked
voice.
about this before with, the valedictorian speech from the kid in, I forget, North Carolina or Oklahoma or somewhere down there.
Where he first attributes it to Trump.
And then it was actually a quote from Obama, and people cheered and then they booed. So there's a lot of those. It comes into our work too. Sometimes the reason that consultants get brought in is to be a different messenger within an organization that has greater influence. And so again, sometimes they're saying the same thing that maybe people within the organization are actually saying, but senior leadership isn't listening to people who are, within the organization versus somebody coming in from the outside.
Yeah, true enough. Okay, so that's that's M.
M.
That's M.
What's I?
Incentives. Which,
one of our favorites.
Yeah, we totally love incentives, and it really is about what kind of intrinsic and extrinsic motivators are appealing to us, and what is going to make it, what is going to draw us into the behavior change.
Right.
Really.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, what's next?
Norms. Norms. So we're strongly influenced by what others do. This is the, social proof, a variety of different things. It's the culture that we operate in, whether that be organizational culture, the culture within our region or area, country. All of those things have a big, big impact on how we behave, and the norms of how we do things are really predictive of if you come into a highly normative situation, it's very hard for you to break those norms that are already pre-established.
Yeah,
and so you're going to probably
corporate cultures, country cultures, they exist and they're profound.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have M, we have I, we have N. Now we're going to go D. for mind. All right, so D is defaults, and this is huge too. Our tendency to rely on defaults, status quo bias, is huge, right? So it's just easier for us to just let whatever's happening happen, and not interrupt that.
Right, and it goes into choice architecture, right? So do you have to click to enter your 401k or click to activate your 401k?
Huge difference.
Those two different ways in how you design a form have a big impact on how people behave subsequently.
Yeah.
All right, so S, salience. Our attention is drawn to what is novel and what seems relevant to us. So this is that vividness. It's the why we think about Schindler's List, the movie, and if you ask people about that, the scene that they remember is when the little girl is going through and they kind of follow her, and the movie's black and white, and she's in a red dress, and that's the only color in the entire movie,
in the whole film,
and it's very vivid and different. It stands out. But then there's also the element of this salience and being relevant to us. So it's the idiosyncratic component of this, right? So
absolutely.
How it fits in with your own idea of who you are, and does it impact you?
Self-identity, self-schema, those things are involved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So go next one.
Priming.
Oh God. What is priming?
I don't even know. I don't even know. But I mean, this is certainly one of our favorites as well, right? Because we know how susceptible, how very fragile we are when it comes to being primed by all sorts of conceivably innocuous things, right? For instance, are you primed with socks today, Kurt? Are you wearing super socks or Einstein socks or?
No, I'm just wearing colorful socks today.
Just colorful socks today. Okay.
I figured it was one of those days. It needed to be colorful. So
I'm wearing warm socks today because it's so cold outside.
Because it's chill outside, man. All right. So now we're getting into A, and it's affect, not effect, affect, which is basically about our emotional associations. And so, again, emotions play a big part in our behavior, much more so than we often attribute it to. We're not the rational players that we tend to like to think we are. We're emotional creatures.
Yeah, wow. That was an interesting sound. And the C, we're almost down to the end here. We're at C, and C is commitments. And I think about this with goal setting and the huge difference between what happens when someone makes a commitment to a goal versus when someone is given a goal and they're not really committed to it.
Yeah.
Huge differences.
Right. This is a bunch of Cialdini's work, right? On public promise is consistent with our outward appearance, reciprocity, all of those types of things.
Yeah.
And the last one is E, and that stands for
ego.
Ego. Oh, good old ego. Yeah, we miss ego. No, but we are driven to do things that make us feel better about ourselves.
Absolutely.
And that feed our ego, feed that component. It's a big thing.
This it always kind of reminded me of the Jeremy Bentham thing with seeking pleasure and avoiding pain as well.
Right. So utility theory, Jeremy Bentham was one of the first to really bring up utility theory from an economic model perspective.
Yeah.
And his sense of utility was much broader than how classical economists kind of look at it today. And there's some very interesting pieces there.
He was
But
terrific.
we digress.
Yeah, he was terrific. Big fan of Bentham. Okay, so East. Let's talk about East, right?
Is it easy to remember East? Is it?
Oh my gosh, I can't believe I did that.
Yeah, well, there you go. East. Let's
East.
go East.
So you
go fast. Go East fast.
Well, and this is one of my favorite models.
It is.
Right?
You use this model all the time.
All the time. So East is easy. It starts with making things easy, make transitions easy, make it frictionless, right? The A is make it attractive, right? So this kind of, again, since these are really derived from MINDSPACE, this is about the incentives and the priming and the salience.
So you and I fall out of this right away because we're not attractive at all. So.
Well, we're not.
I mean, it's true. I'm just being factual here.
That is factual.
That's why we are doing this on a podcast and not video. There we go.
I think it's more about making the messages attractive.
I'm sorry.
than
Yeah, sorry. No, I was going the wrong way there.
And okay, so easy, attractive, social. S is social. And oh man, I'm just lately just on an absolute tear when it comes to the importance of social groups and who we identify with and what's going on socially. And the last is T for timely.
Timely.
Yeah, it's got to happen. And Cialdini, his whole book Persuasion,
Yeah.
Dan Pink's new book. Timeliness is really important when it comes to affecting behavior change.
Right. Good.
Okay.
So those are the two mnemonics that kind of the British Insights team
Came
brought
up with,
forth,
yeah.
right? And they used EAST, not easy, EAST, because again, many people, it's hard to remember mind space and all of the different factors that go into it. I mean,
It is.
I mean, Michael gave us a look of fear, I think, when we asked him that question almost, but he did a nice job of naming them off the top of his head. I'm going, yeah, it is hard. It's however many different things you need to remember. But they're both very powerful tools to think about the components when you're looking at a situation and you want to bring a behavioral lens to that situation. They're easy ways to think about. So, all right, in this situation, is it easy? Is it social? Is it attractive? Is it timely? And if one of those isn't, then what can you do in that to make it more easier, to make it more attractive, to make it more social, or to get the timing better on it?
Absolutely. Okay, so Kurt, we just went round and round on that. Tell me what really hit you, what really stands out for you in our discussion with Michael.
There's a couple different things. Obviously, we could talk about motivated reasoning, about tribes and false polarization around tribes, which I think is really interesting. And I think I want to get to both of those, but I want to start with one of the priming things he talked about, where they looked at crime and either labeling it as crime as a virus or crime as like a wild beast.
Yeah, the highly emotive, animalistic kind of things.
But the difference in then the policy reaction to the way that it was presented, right? That prime, whether that prime be a virus or if the prime would be a wild animal. Very different, right? Virus, dirty, unclean, so you clean up the environment. You take away those opportunities for it to thrive. And so that gets more into prevention and various different pieces. Whereas that wild animal, you just have
predator.
The predator. You have to control that predator.
Yeah.
And so it's more about then locking them up and putting them away and throwing away that key. So
those metaphors mean something. Words matter.
Words matter a lot, and again, you think about this in how we respond to, and Michael's done a lot of work with in the political arena and in policy, and so the way that you frame something going into a policy discussion, again, it can seem innocuous, but has a significant impact on the policy that comes out, which impacts thousands, millions of people. And that's powerful. And so to be able to be conscious of that and either understand that it's being used or to purposefully use that, I think is an interesting thing. And again, there could be some ethical questions on that, but
it certainly does bring up ethical questions. It's not to say that we all have an axe to grind, I suppose, to some degree, right? We all have opinions, we all have perspectives, and we're going to express those. It's going to be very difficult to have a conversation or prepare a statement without, that is completely diluted of any kind of perspective.
Right.
So we're going to have it. The words that we choose will make a difference.
It's interesting, as you were just talking about that, what came to my mind is, how do we talk about it to ourselves? Do we reference crime for our own selves as a virus, or do we reference crime as a wild beast for ourselves, and how we do our self-talk and the way that we need to be thinking about how we're talking about those situations? And it can be, crime is a good example, but it could be anything just think of any type of topic, right? Our political opponent, a situation that is dealing with what we're going to do with our children. It could be a variety of different things.
Literally, just about anything that we could imagine having a conversation about is going to be influenced by this.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. What else?
Well, so I love this component that we got off on this tangent with Michael about tribes and the impact that tribes have in the social component. And he brought up a really interesting...
Which is a favorite topic of ours.
It is a favorite topic of ours. But he brought up this component about false polarization. False polarization. And I'm going to quote him. So, you also have things like false polarization. So you have a tendency to think that the outgroup is more different from you than it actually is.
Yeah, that's huge right there, isn't it?
Oh my gosh. And we do that all of the time. I was actually just having a conversation with James Brewer this morning. Okay. Who was one of our first podcast guests on here. He was. And we started talking about something similar to this, where we were looking at the way that we view people and in a political perspective is that they are so far apart. But when you actually look at their beliefs around them, they actually overlap a lot more than we give them, than we perceive them to be.
Yeah.
And which is exactly what this is. It's saying that we tend to over-exaggerate minor differences and then extrapolate that out to everything else about these other groups.
It's particularly problematic right now.
Exactly.
In the political discourse, especially, right? And we've talked about this before about how marketers have used these tools to the Mac versus PC ads. For many years, Mac was really trying to show that anything that wasn't a Mac was just sort of dull and slow and geeky and not a good way, right? And it really works against us to continue. It certainly helps from a combative perspective and a competitive perspective, but it doesn't necessarily build bridges.
No, it doesn't help in building community.
No, not at all.
At least, I take that back. It helps in building community within the in-group.
Within the in-group only.
But
That's right.
It does not allow for the influx of outside ideas or outside people into either the conversations or that community that is pre-established. It's actually a really powerful tool to leverage to help keep people in the in-group. And it's why I think some of the political discourse that is going on now tends to get further and further either to the left or to the right. And so you see the Democratic Party leaning to much more progressive in a lot of their rhetoric. You see some of the conservative party leaning much more to the right side. And I'm using the wrong hands as I'm demonstrating this to...
Fortunately, our listeners won't ever know.
So there you go. But I think that false polarization is a really interesting topic and one that we need to be thinking of. And so I think for listeners here and for us, right, is to step back, take a moment to think, are they really as different as we think they are?
Yeah.
And most of the time they're not. It's one of the things I love. I'm in a Rotary Club, and my Rotary Club has a wide diversity of people in it, both from political spectrums, but also age, a number of sexual preferences and various different things. And what I love is that those, not that they're not talked about, but that we tend to focus in on the good work that we're doing. And so you see people doing great work and bringing in this wonderful pieces without those labels. And so without the labels, you see the people and you're going, look, they're raking leaves with me for these people that can't do it. Who cares if
the differences don't matter.
The differences don't matter. Yeah. We're feeding hungry people. We're doing all of this good work, and it doesn't matter. And so that component, I think, if we can get more of that, I think that is much more powerful way of looking at this world and showing up in the world than the element of kind of us versus them.
Yeah.
All right. What about you?
Oh gosh, the whole tribal discussion was important to me. False polarization, the replication, of course, Michael's, key thing about the replication crisis, or the way that he addressed it, is just, hey, sometimes things don't work. And then he went through reasons why the UK tax collection letter didn't work in Albuquerque.
Right.
He dissected that and pulled that apart so that we understood there are good reasons why it didn't work.
And I love just that process, right? So to the point, and we talked about this with David Yoakum, we talked about this with some other guests, there's more to learn sometimes in these tests that don't work than the ones that do. Yeah. We become more intelligent when we find out where the edges are. What is the scope of this lane that we're in? We talked about it with Kuhn-Smets, right? And in talking through the replication crisis, and he was saying it's not, because you have all these different factors that come into play, and the context of how you do the replication study.
That can be very, very subtle.
It can be very subtle, the difference in culture, the differences in different pieces. But what I love about that is that we're able to then really highlight when this application works and when it probably won't work. And so we're getting more specific in it. We tend to in my opinion, we tend to overgeneralize scientific research and then attribute it to across all people everywhere at any time.
Right. Well, in part because it's not very fun to say, well, every time, or it's likely that when 22 students at the University of Pennsylvania are in a room and asked to do this, this is how they're going to behave. I mean, that just...
Well, and then you go to the next step, which is, well, then it's maybe not these 22, it's all students at University of Pennsylvania. And then you go up, well, it's all people in Pennsylvania, or then it's all people in the United States, and then it's all people in the entire world. And I think there's a certain point where we have to be very careful about how we generalize.
At the same time, all of these studies do point to deeply seated, for instance, when we study biases or heuristics,
right?
These do point to the fact that they are there, that the biases and the decision-making tools that we use, those frailties, they are there. They are present in the human condition.
Yes, they are, and it's I think part of us as researchers, our job is to understand how those to identify those biases, right? That's to uncover those from around the human kind of dynamic, but B, then to help understand how they show up in different contexts. So I think that's really important. So
yeah, I think so too.
All right. And I see that you want to talk about music because you wrote it on a sheet of paper and showed it to me. Oh, was that supposed to be like a clue between you and me that our listeners weren't supposed to get? Sorry.
This is like the dream when I was a child of going to school with only my underwear on. It just happened in real life.
You're wearing pants. I mean, people just understand. He is wearing pants. There you go. All right, so music. Let's talk music. What do you want to talk about?
Well, just teeing up this band, Ockerville River, from Austin, Texas, just kind of made me start thinking about, cool bands from Texas, cool musical artists from Texas. Willie Nelson, for instance, or Stevie Ray Vaughan.
Okay.
Or Buddy Holly.
Buddy Holly's from Texas.
Buddy Holly's a Texas boy.
I did not know that.
Yeah, so some of the very earliest roots of rock and roll come from Texas. Yeah, how about that?
The Lone Star State. I did not know that.
The Lone Star State, yes.
So is there a Texas sound? Do you think that there is a Texas sound?
I don't think so anymore.
Yeah?
I don't think so anymore. I think Austin is is aggregating an Americana vibe about them, much like Nashville is, much more of a country vibe, but I don't think there's a Texas sound anymore.
So Austin, home of South by Southwest,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So I've never been. Have you been?
Yes.
So I have this perception of South by Southwest as this kind of really hip, cool, like big bands playing in really small venues and these unheard of bands playing right next to them and all of this thing. Is that over sensationalized hype of what it might have been way back in the day, but now it's commercial?
It's highly commercialized, and that impression is probably more oversimplified. So there are great bands that play in small venues at South by Southwest, but gosh, I think over the course of 5 days, there's something like 20,000 acts that play.
Oh my gosh.
It's insane. So so bars, there. I just remember on 4th Street, there are all these bars lined up next to each other, and they have 4 levels. And they're not intended to have music on all of them, but during South by Southwest, every level has a different band on them playing all damn day. So at 10 o'clock in the morning, there are 4 bands playing, and they play for 30 minutes or 40, maybe 40 minutes, and then they're changing out, and then there's 4 other bands in every one of these venues. They're just chalking them up. Only like in the nice theaters are they doing, and some of the big tents on some of the open air grounds are they doing Lady Gaga and Elton John and big concert kinds of things where it's just one show, one act, or maybe 2 acts a night.
Okay.
But they do, occasionally you'll be in a place where somebody really terrific will come in and sit in with a unknown band. Some great player will do that, but you can't predict those kinds of things.
Right. Well, with 20,000 acts going on,
it's crazy.
Right.
It's just crazy. So Texas music, South by Southwest, enjoy it.
So with that, thank you for listening. If you do feel the urge, please go on out and rate us on your local pod service, whatever that would be. And we hope you come back and listen again.